So, the original question that we ask ourselves is social media advancing the richness of human life? Which is really the question of, is social media a tool for development? And in trying to answer that question, we first defined what social media is. Then we examined how social media is changing society. We then looked at, and we said that, well, it's both positive and negative. It helps promote communities of common concern and conviction. It helps the economy grow. But at the same time, there are also drawbacks, like the loss of poverty, cyberbullying, or addiction or overuse. I think the evidence there suggests that social media is a double-edged sword. You can wield it for good, and you can wield it for bad. From there, we went to the question, all right, how then can social media help promote good in areas such as rural development, environment protection, education, disaster risk management? And we looked at examples which showed that in these areas, social media is already making significant impacts. And in a way, only our creativity is keeping us from being able to use it more widely. Then we ask the question, can it promote good governance? Or the bigger question, can it help citizens participate in setting societal goals and participating in the activities to be able to reach those goals? And we looked at a number of issues related to that, including social media and as providing new channels for participation, social media as promoting collaborative governance, social media as a means of knowledge management, and the final sort of question that we raise is, how about public communication? What about government using the technology in order to tell the world what it's doing, in order to engage the citizens, in order to be able to get the citizens to collaborate more with government activities? So now, if we're convinced that yes, social media is in fact a tool, a means to widen individual opportunities, enhance freedoms, and generally make life better, then what then do we do as governments? Or what do we then do as leaders in government to harness the power of social media? So it's a pretty long introduction to the question of how do we then develop our own social media policy. I think if we've decided that in fact we're going to go for a social media policy in our government or in our agency, the first thing that we have to do is to get executive buy-in. We should be able to get the leadership of the organization or of government at the highest levels support the initiative. Now, this is very important because as we've seen in other fields like e-government in general, leadership matters. If the leaders are behind the initiative, the rest of the organization would likely follow. But if leaders are lukewarm or does not exhibit support for the project, then the project usually dies. By having the executives or the top leaders lead the charge of social media, they send the message throughout the organization that social media is valued and should be utilized. The next thing that we should do is use what is called the POST approach. P-O-S-T approach. Now, POST obviously is an acronym. P stands for people. So the questions that you have to answer and to look into are, who are your stakeholders? And where are they in terms of the social media space? So if most of your stakeholders are in Facebook, then that's where you should go, right? There's no sense of making or having a Twitter strategy when the population or your significant stakeholders are not in Twitter. Now, obviously, sometimes you will have to in a way, disaggregate people, right? It's very general. Maybe you should ask also, where are my significant stakeholders? So if you're in policy development, then maybe the university is a significant stakeholder for you. And so you look at where university professors most likely converge in social media. So here maybe academia.edu may be a better site for you to target than Facebook in general. As we've seen, for instance, in the health information, in Jamaica, they discovered that their most at-risk sector of the population, meaning sex workers and gay men, also use social media heavily, Facebook, and so that's where they go and spread the message. So that's the first P, people. The second letter in POST is O, and this means objectives. What are your goals? What do you want to accomplish with social media? Because maybe social media is not the best tool for you to do what you want. If you want only one-way communication, social media can do that, but you're not maximizing the tool. As we said, social media is about dialogue. So, do you want people to participate in the design of policy? Do you want people to participate in the design of public service? You have to be very clear as to what you want to achieve and to make sure that social media is the best tool for you to do this. The third is strategy. Plan how relationships will change, and you do that by imagining the end point. Again, so you want an actively engaged business sector in the design of business or economic policies. Well, okay, so what is it? How exactly do you want to do that? And you do that by imagining the end state. And then understanding where you are, and then sort of acting to reach that. And finally, the technology. Decide what social technologies application should you use. So again, notice that the technology is the last question that you should ask. Right? So you begin with people, you then have objectives, then you have strategy, and then you find the technology that best suits your objective and strategy. So don't start by saying, I want to blog. The blog must be responsive to a strategy. I want to tweet. Again, what? Why? Why tweet and not a wiki? Right? So those are questions that you could only respond to once it is clear to you who the people you're targeting are what are your objectives, and then what is the strategy that you have to reach your objective. In a sense, the technology is just a component of the strategy. So, to review, 1, you want to get the leadership behind the initiative, and 2, you have to do analysis based on POST, people, objective, strategy, and technology. The other thing that you have to do is that you have to look at your legal and policy environment. That means you have to anchor your social media policy and strategy on the broader e-government and public communication strategy and policy. And you also have to ensure that you follow existing laws, policies, and regulations. Right? You don't want to come up with a social media strategy all set and ready to launch, and then you discover that there are rules that does not allow civil servants to talk publicly or to engage, or that there are regulations that would inhibit civil servants from participating in social media. So don't forget about the wider environment. Make sure that your social media policy is aligned to your overall e-government and public communication strategy, and you have to make sure that the rules encourage rather than inhibit participation. Then you have to set the principles for participation. You have to lay out the basic principles to guide civil servants in the use of social media. You have to also explain the principles that animate your overall social media policy. Because it's not, you shouldn't just tell people that this is the policy. They also have to understand the reason behind the policies. Because understanding the reasons behind or the principles that animate the policy allows them a certain amount of leeway, allows them to behave better rather than just say, okay, I'm just constricted and I'm just going to follow it closely. A good example of guidelines for civil servant is the one that was produced by the UK government. What is interesting here is that there are only 5 guidelines or 5 rules. You don't want to have 25 rules because most likely people will not remember all 25. So the shorter the better. So here in the UK they only have 5. So there's almost no excuse not to know since you only have to remember 5. And I think it's also good in general. Right? The less rules you have, the less complicated things get. So what are the UK's guidance for civil servants? The first is be credible. Right? So civil servants online, in social media, must be accurate, fair, thorough, and transparent. Number 2, be consistent. As civil servants, you want to encourage constructive criticism and deliberation. You have to be cordial, honest, and professional at all times. The third guideline is be responsive. When you gain insight, share it where it is appropriate. The fourth is be integrated. Whenever possible, align online participation with other offline communications. So for instance, if you're discussing an issue, you could always point to a printed material or your website where they could research on this issue or read up on the issue further. And finally, be a civil servant, which means you have to remember that you are an ambassador for your organization. Whenever possible, disclose your position as a representative of your department or your agency. Now, I think this is something that a lot of civil servants tend to forget, right? When they're online, they assume that they remain the private person and they could speak their mind. Unfortunately, people don't see it that way. People see you constantly as a representative of government. And as such, you have to behave accordingly. So, just 5 rules. And if you follow them, I don't think you'll go astray. And you'll be able to behave in such a way that you are able to effectively use social media. So what are these again? You have to be credible. You have to be consistent. You have to be responsive. You have to be integrated. And you have to be a civil servant. There are other issues, of course, related to civil servants participating in social media. One of which is staff contribution guidelines. So for instance, you've decided that you want to have a wiki in order as a tool for knowledge management, like Intellipedia or like Diplopedia. So what you need to do is to issue, again, clear guidance on staff contribution. So how do they behave so that everybody knows the rules of the road and everybody behaves accordingly and you maximize the tool that you are using. Let's look at Diplopedia. Remember, this is the Wikipedia that the State Department has created and is using in order to manage the knowledge, to ensure that knowledge is not lost or that knowledge is systematically transferred from one group of diplomats to another and from one generation of diplomats to another. Now, again, Diplopedia guidelines, like the UK guideline, is relatively short. We had 5 guidelines for the UK. In Diplopedia, they had 6. Right? So let's go through them. The first is assume the good intention of others. Now, this is very important, I guess, in the bureaucracy. And sometimes people ask, well, why is he writing that section? Is he trying to promote his image? Is he trying to ensure that history will see his term as ambassador in the best light possible? Or is he, and sometimes you say, oh, that could be an instrument of self-promotion. If we all start thinking that way, then that will be the end of our knowledge management initiative. I think it's best if we just assume that people participate in initiatives like Diplopedia or Intellipedia because they genuinely want to share information, because in sharing information, you get a better sense of what's going on and not just your own perspective. Now, of course, assuming good intention of others is not enough. There are other things that guides diplomats in using Diplopedia. The second is, if something is wrong, change it. Right? Don't start putting... Again, here, it's important that the first principle is important because you say, okay, this is obviously wrong, and the only reason why this guy did it is because he wants to promote himself. Right? So, that's why we have assumed the good intentions of others. It was a mistake. We're human beings. Maybe he just forgot, or he genuinely see it that way, but the rest of us do not. So then, if there is something wrong, change it. Don't bitch about it. Don't start rumors and gossip about it. Simply change it. And of course, if something is missing, add it. Right? Don't think, oh, it's missing because he purposely forgot. Right? Don't think that. Just correct it. Just add what is missing. The fourth guideline is use plain language. We don't want to be elaborate. We don't want to use a lot of adjectives, right? We don't want to use jargon. Because again, the point is to communicate ideas, experiences, in order to gain insight. And plain language helps, or it's really better than elaborate language. The fifth is use the discussion tab to discuss an article. Right. So, if you think that something is wrong with the article, that it does not quite capture events as they are, or it does not quite capture policy as it was intended, then you discuss it with the others who have written or have contributed to that entry. This is true also in Wikipedia. They do this. You see that there is a warning that this is not fully vetted yet, that there's still some issues and discussions. So do that, because again, what you want to do is to be able to capture what had happened as accurately as possible, or you want to capture the policy as best you could. And finally, use a neutral point of view, right? This is just like the dictum, use plain language. Do not be an advocate of one version of events as opposed to another. And you want as many versions of the event as possible. And you do not want to inflame passion and other things. So please use neutral point of view. So using the 6 guidelines, Diplopedias emerges a very successful experiment or undertaking in trying to hold on to that knowledge, in order to preserve that knowledge, in order to be able to systematically pass insights from one group of diplomats to another. Now, one final point about staff contribution. Do not imagine that everybody in the organization, everybody or all in the organization would flock to social media for social knowledge, right? Once you open it up, there will be droves of people. What has been the experience so far is that about 90% of your people would probably not contribute to social media. They would probably be contributors. Some of them will be active lurkers, which is to say they keep up with what's going on, they promote it, but they really do not contribute to the body of knowledge that you are creating. Only 10% of your people would do that. And of the 10%, only 1% will be very active. Right? This is a new version of the 80-20 rule, right? Where 20% of the people in your organization actually do 80% of the work. So now we have the new rule of 99 and 1. 90% will probably be just consumers. 9% will be participants, will contribute, and only 1% will actively contribute. So if you see that only 1% of your people are contributing to the exercise, don't be disheartened. That, in fact, is the norm. Now, maybe in the future, we would increase this number, but at this point, again, because perhaps this is something new, this is something that we're still kind of experimenting with, these are the numbers that you should expect. 99 and 1. All right. Now, maybe part of the reason why it's 99-1 is because people in the organization are not yet comfortable in the use of social media. They don't feel confident enough about the technology, hence they hold back in terms of participation. So that's your other challenge then, is to improve or to build the capacity of people in your organization to use the technology, both for internal purposes, if you have knowledge management initiative, as well as for engaging with the public and the stakeholders. Now, there's a new concept. Remember in governance, social media and governance, we talked about government or Gov 2.0, right? It's collaborative governance, and social media has made that possible. So if you have government 2.0, you must have civil servant 2.0 as well, right? You can't have government 2.0 with civil servants 1.0. Let me explain. Civil servants 2.0 are those who are proficient in social media and interactive policy making, and they can offer solutions to society, involve members of the public in policy, and apply new forms of online cooperation. So you have to know the tools of the trade for you to be able to participate in Gov 2.0 if you're a civil servant. Because the traditional civil servant, again, civil servant 1.0, are experts in preparing reports, managing decision-making processes, dealing with politically sensitive issues. You still need to have those skills. But if you only have those skills alone, you will not be able to actively be part of Gov 2.0, or you cannot help institutionalize collaborative governance in your country. And so, you have to become civil servants 2.0, proficient in social media and interactive policy making. And of course, we were not born digital. The generations after us are. That means we have to build capacity. We have to develop training programs so that civil servants in our government become civil servants 2.0. Now, these are activities that requires resources. This cannot be done on the cheap, and so you have to have resources. Now, how much, right? How big a budget do you need to make this happen? How many people do you require? Again, that is something that you'll have to answer yourself based on your activities, based on your ambitions, based on the level of capacity or competence of your organization in terms of social media. However, there are, I think, three interesting ways by which you should look at how to look at the resources that are required. One is you could see yourself as guerrillas, right? So, what are guerrillas? Guerrillas are those who win through small but disciplined spend in social media. So you focus tightly on what you do, and you spend only as much as you need in order to make that happen. You compare that to shadow jumpers. What they do is produce a lot of resources into social media efforts on areas that are unlikely to produce results. Okay, let's go back to posts, right? Where are your people? Are they in Facebook? If most of them are, then go to Facebook. If your people are not, if the stakeholders are not on Twitter, why should you use Twitter? And you could blog to death if your stakeholders do not read blogs. Right? So again, look at where you could maximize your resources, and do not be shadow jumpers putting resources in areas that will not produce results. The other bad thing that you could do is you could be peanut butter spreaders, right? So imagine what you do when you have in a sandwich, right? Is that you make sure that it's evenly the peanut butter is evenly and thinly spread across. Again, this is not necessarily the best way to do it, because you're spending a lot on social media, but you're not spending enough in some areas and you're spending too much in other areas. That's what happens when you spend it. And so you say, all right, how many social media types are there? 6. Let's spend on all, right? We have blogs, we will have wiki, we will have microblogs, we will have participate in content communities, we will participate in forums, we will be in social networking sites. That's the worst thing that you could do. Pick and choose. Be guerrillas. You will win through small but disciplined spending in specific types. One where your people are, or your citizens are, and one that would achieve your objectives. Now, the other thing about that you need to worry about in terms of developing a social media policy is you have to look at security, right? So, because once you open up to public engagement, citizen participation, you have to look at the risks and then have to come up with policy on how to mitigate the risks. Now, some studies suggest that governments and government agencies using social media has to look at 2 key risks. One is you post unauthorized official information. Again, because if you have because posting information online could have significant impacts on other things in society. For instance, you leak GDP forecast or you leak inflation rates in your blog, right? Again, that may have an effect in terms of the stock market. That may have effect on investment issues. Investment decisions by other people. So there are good reasons why some information are embargoed. And you should follow those rules, because sometimes you do not anticipate, you do not foresee the consequence of your action because you've not thought it through. And maybe the best for civil servants is to be conservative about this, particularly about releasing information, official information to the public. The other danger, of course, is you post too much information, which means that the danger is not so much that your readers will you will inundate your stakeholders with the information, but the danger is that other countries listening in on your conversation, or those who do not share the same objective as you, may be able to put things together from your blog, from somebody else's blog, that could help undermine your overall effort, right? Just remember that it's not just you putting out information out there. There are other public officials, and that somebody with intentions other than good can put them all together and make life fairly difficult for you. So these are the 2 key risks that all governments have to worry about when they engage in social media. The posting of unauthorized official information and posting too much information. Now, how then do you mitigate such risks? How to make sure you do not engage in them, or your colleagues do not engage in them. The first is you have to have policy controls in order to address behavior associated with protecting data or information, which means that it's very clear to officials or civil servants in social media that they know what is and what is not allowed by way of disclosure. What information must be kept secret, confidential, certainly not top secret, so they do not either unwittingly or wittingly engage release official information or do not provide too much information. The second issue is, second action rather, security action that you could take is provide for acquisition controls. Particularly though the hosted information systems, social media websites that you use, you must have some level of risk management, mitigation, and acceptance of residual risk when you use these public or hosted sites. The third is training controls. You have to provide periodic awareness and training of policy, guidance, and best practices. In the US, they have the regular security awareness training for federal government officials. So it's an annual thing. So you may have trained your people properly, you may have the policies in place, but you have to ensure that they remember these things. And that's where training controls come in. Then you could also have network controls. You use network security technologies that contribute to a defense-in-depth security posture for securing a department's infrastructure. Well, you need to do this anyway, not just for social media, but for all your IT, right? And then also host controls, use endpoint protections, specifically safeguarding against social media attacks. So, again, security is important. We have to anticipate risks, identify them, and we have to mitigate risks. And we do so through policy controls, acquisition controls, training controls, network controls, and host controls. Now, what else do we do? We've set the policy, we've trained the people, we've provided resources, we've secured the sites. We now measure our progress, right? Because it's no use having a social media policy, setting up all of these infrastructure, guidelines, controls, and then not measure whether in fact you're achieving some progress or not. Here again, there are sort of three kinds of things that you could try and hope for. Three good end results, or maybe good, better, best results. The basic is you track the basics, right? And this is easily compiled. How many followers do you have? How many likes? How many times is your posted shared? How many comments do you get? And here you could get tools for this, like Google Analytics and all of that, because you just have to know. You know, the basic principle in all management schools is like, if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. Right? So measuring the basics is very important. The second step after measuring or tracking the basics is we have to analyze. So success is determined by how social media achieved its goal. one of the traditional measures, and then use traditional measures, and then develop a methodology for measuring these in social media. So remember, like post, the number 2 thing there is objective. You have to clearly define your objective. So at the end of the year, the first question that you ask yourself is, well, how many people follow us? How many people like? And how many shares? How many times is it shared? And what are the kinds of comments that we get? So if you say, oh, we get 100,000 followers and like 50,000 likes, and it's been shared 20,000 times, does it mean you have achieved your objective? Not necessarily, right? It may well be that you got closer to your stakeholders, they like what you're doing, but you've not achieved your mission of engaging them in the policy dialogue. Right? So then you have to ask the question, well, what does it mean for me that I have engaged my people or my stakeholders in a policy dialogue? You have to make, there are no quick or easy answers to that. You have to answer that yourselves. But you use the basics as a way of answering that. That's just the basics. Tracking the basics is just the first step in terms of answering that. Again, going back to post. Remember, the S, strategy. So what you want to do is to begin at the end point. What do you want to achieve? So then here you ask the question, have I achieved what I hope to achieve? Have I reached the end point that I have predefined as my end point? So that's what this means, that you track and you analyze. And then finally, even better, you track, you analyze, and you integrate. So here, success is recognized at the highest levels. Measure for success is fully incorporated in regular reporting, and the information is considered during strategic planning. At this level of success, what you've done is that you've succeeded in using social media to define the strategy, the future strategy of your organization. Right? So this is real success. It's not only that you have so many likes and shares. It's not only that you have achieved the goals that you want to achieve for the use of that particular platform, but the organization is now using social media information as one of the things to look at when you do strategy, overall social media. I'm sorry, not just overall social media strategy, but overall organization or government as a whole strategy. So it's become mainstream. It's now recognized not as a quirky activity of some elements in the organization, but something that is vital for the whole organization itself. Right? Just to review, how do we measure progress? We track and analyze. We track, we analyze, and we integrate the results in terms of overall strategy. Now, there are other issues in terms of developing social media policy, like copyright, privacy, appropriate use. But these are issues that you could look at in the text itself or in other areas, or you could research them online and look at other best practices. But I think you will do well if you focus on the things that we discussed as important in terms of developing social media for development policy. And those are, one, make sure you have the support of the leadership, strong support. One, you use the post approach, people, objectives, strategy, and technology. You look at the policy and the legal environment and you make sure that you conform with them. or at least aligned with them. Then you have to define the principles for the behavior of civil servants online. You have to have staff contribution guidelines. You have to build capacity, create civil servant 2.0. You have to provide appropriate resources. You have to take care of security. And you have to measure progress. If you do these things, you're well on your way in coming up with a policy that would maximize the use of social media for development purposes. So there are other issues that you have to consider when developing social media for development policy. That includes copyright, privacy, and even appropriate use. But I think we've captured the basics, the most important elements of the policy. And if you focus on leadership, securing the support of the top leaders of the organization for your social media policy, if you use the POST approach, people, objective, strategy, and technology, if you ensure that you align your social media with your legal and e-government policy and strategy, if you focus on principles and guidance for civil service on social media, if you provide them with appropriate resources, if there's a good capability or training program, and worry about security and measure success, then I think you have what it will take to have a good social media for development policy.